Sometimes the life we're forced into becomes the one we needed all along. In the rugged highlands of Colorado Territory, 1881, Caleb Brennan, a mountain man who chose solitude over family, finds himself trapped by his own kin into marrying Martha Henley, a widow 15 years older. The whole town of Pinewood Hollow watches with pity and quiet laughter. They see it as charity, a duty to care for a woman nobody else wanted. But what happens next surprises everyone. These two unlikely souls begin building something together first, an old gathering hall, then barn dances that bring the whole community alive again. The family who forced this marriage watches in disbelief. How did two people, pushed together against their will, become exactly what this town had been missing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Brennan had been living alone in the mountains above Pinewood Hollow for 12 years, and that suited him just fine. His cabin sat nestled in a stand of pine trees at 8,000 feet, where the air was thin and clean, and the only voices he heard were the wind through the branches and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. He was 34 years old, lean and weathered, with hands that knew the weight of a steel trap and eyes that could track a deer through 3 miles of forest without losing the trail. Every morning before dawn, he rose from his simple bed, stoked the fire in his iron stove, and boiled coffee so strong it could strip paint. He kept a journal on a small wooden table near the window, a worn leather book with pages filled with his observations. Weather patterns, animal movements, the first frost, the last thaw. It was a solitary record of a solitary life, and he'd never shown it to another living soul. Caleb was the youngest of 5 Brennan children, born into a family that had built half of Pinewood Hollow with their own hands. His father, William Brennan, had been a builder and a pillar of the community until his death 15 years ago. His 3 older brothers, Nathaniel, Thomas, and Jacob, had each taken up the family trade, raising families of their own, building homes and barns, and the sort of lives that required a man to be present, responsible, and accountable. His sister Sarah had married a rancher and given their mother 6 grandchildren before passing away herself. Caleb had tried that life once. He'd worked alongside his brothers for 2 years after their father died, learning the craft, doing his duty. But he'd felt suffocated by it, the weight of expectation, the constant need to measure up to Nathaniel's leadership, Thomas's precision, Jacob's easy charm. He wasn't good at any of it. He was clumsy with a saw, impatient with measurements, and utterly hopeless at the glad-handing required to win contracts and keep customers satisfied. So one morning, he'd packed his belongings, told his mother he was sorry, and walked into the mountains. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, rough work, but solid, and he'd learned to trap, to hunt, to survive on his own terms. He came down to Pinewood Hollow once a month to sell his furs and buy supplies, and that was enough human contact for him. The town itself was small but thriving, tucked into a valley where 2 streams converged, and the soil was rich enough for farming. Main Street ran for 3 blocks, lined with false-fronted buildings that housed the general store, the saloon, the church, the doctor's office, and the land office. Most folks knew each other by name, and everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where a man couldn't sneeze without 3 people offering him a handkerchief and 2 more asking if he'd caught a chill. Martha Henley lived on the eastern edge of town in a 2-story house her late husband Samuel had built with his own hands. Samuel had been a master carpenter, known throughout the territory for his craftsmanship. He died 3 years ago when a ladder gave way beneath him while he was repairing the church steeple. He'd been 52. Martha had been 47 then, and she was 50 now, a woman with silver threading through her dark hair and a face that showed the lines of a life well lived. She'd raised 3 children in that house. All of them had grown and moved away, her son to Denver to work in banking, her two daughters married and settled in other towns. They wrote letters. They visited twice a year, but Martha lived alone in a house built for a family, maintaining it with the same quiet competence she'd shown all her life. Samuel had taught her everything he knew about woodworking. They'd worked side by side for 25 years, and Martha could measure a board, cut a joint, and plane a surface, as well as any man in the territory. After Samuel died, she'd kept his tools oiled and sharp, hanging in their proper places in the workshop behind the house. She took in mending and sewing work to supplement the small savings Samuel had left her, and she kept a garden that produced more vegetables than one woman could eat. She was respected in Pinewood Hollow. People tipped their hats to her on the street. Women brought her pies and included her in quilting circles. But there was also pity in their eyes, and Martha felt it like a weight on her shoulders. Poor Martha. All alone in that big house. What will she do when she's too old to manage? The Brennan siblings, Nathaniel, Thomas, Jacob, and Sarah, had noticed Martha's situation with growing concern. They were good people, the kind who felt responsible for their community. And they'd also noticed that their youngest brother was wasting his life in the mountains, avoiding the family that loved him and the responsibilities that came with being a Brennan. One autumn evening they gathered in Nathaniel's parlor, the four of them sitting around a table with the lamp turned low, and they talked about Martha's future, about Caleb's stubborn isolation, about duty and family and what it meant to take care of your own. "He's not getting any younger," Thomas said, his carpenter's hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "And neither is she." "It would solve both problems," Jacob added. "Always the practical one. She needs someone to help maintain that property. He needs to rejoin the living." Sarah was quieter, more thoughtful. "You can't force people into marriage. That's not right." But Nathaniel, the eldest and the one who'd inherited their father's sense of duty, shook his head slowly. "Sometimes people need a push toward what's good for them. Caleb's been running for 12 years. Martha's too proud to ask for help. Maybe they need each other more than either of them knows." They talked into the night, convincing themselves that what they were planning was an act of love, not manipulation. By the time they parted ways, they'd made their decision. They would bring Caleb down from his mountain, and they would see him married to Martha Henley. It would be good for both of them. It had to be. What they didn't consider, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that forcing two people together who wanted nothing to do with each other might just be the spark that would change everything. Not just for Caleb and Martha, but for the entire town of Pinewood Hollow. Up in his cabin, Caleb was checking his trap lines and noting in his journal that the elk were moving lower in elevation, a sign that winter would come early. He had no idea that his life was about to be turned upside down, and that the solitude he'd fought so hard to preserve was about to be shattered by the well-meaning interference of the family he'd left behind. The confrontation came on a crisp October morning when Caleb rode into town for supplies. He'd planned to be in and out within an hour, pick up flour, coffee, salt, maybe a new whetstone, if Henderson had one in stock, and then disappear back into the mountains before anyone could corner him with small talk. He should have known better. Nathaniel was waiting outside the general store, arms crossed over his broad chest. Thomas stood to his left, Jacob to his right. Sarah sat on the bench near the door, her face a mixture of determination and apology. They'd positioned themselves like a wall, and Caleb felt his stomach tighten as he dismounted. "We need to talk," Nathaniel said. No greeting, no warmth. Just those 4 words that had preceded every serious family discussion Caleb could remember. "I've got trapping to do," Caleb replied, tying his horse to the rail. "Whatever this is, it can wait." "No, it can't." Thomas stepped forward, blocking the store entrance. "We've let you hide long enough, Caleb. 12 years is long enough." People were starting to notice. Mrs. Patterson paused on her way to the post office. Henderson came to the store window, pretending to arrange a display, but clearly listening. The barber stopped sweeping his stoop. In a town like Pinewood Hollow, a public family confrontation was entertainment worth witnessing. Caleb felt heat rising in his chest. "You want to do this here? In front of everybody?" "You won't meet with us in private," Jacob said quietly. "You won't come to Sunday dinners. You won't answer letters. What choice did you give us?" Sarah stood, and Caleb saw tears in her eyes. That hit harder than anything his brothers could say. "Please, Caleb, just listen." Nathaniel pulled something from his coat pocket, a worn, leather-bound book that Caleb recognized immediately. The Brennan family Bible, passed down through 3 generations. Their father had recorded every birth, marriage, and death in the pages at the front. Seeing it in Nathaniel's hands felt like an invocation, a summoning of ghosts and obligations. "Do you remember what Pa used to say?" Nathaniel asked, his voice softer now. "That family takes care of its own, that we're only as strong as our weakest member, that duty isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary." "Don't quote Pa at me," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Martha Henley is struggling," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Samuel's been gone 3 years, and she's burning through what little savings he left. That house is too much for one person to maintain. The roof needs work. The well needs repairs. She's too proud to ask for help, and her own children are too far away to provide it." "That's unfortunate," Caleb said, "but it's not my problem." "Yes, it is." Nathaniel's voice hardened. "Because we're making it your problem. You're unmarried, she's alone. You know how to work with your hands, even if you ran away from carpentry. She needs someone to help maintain that property and provide security. You need to stop hiding from life and rejoin this family." The full weight of what they were suggesting hit Caleb like a physical blow. "You want me to marry her? Martha Henley is 50 years old, I'm 34. This is insane." "Age doesn't matter," Thomas said. "What matters is duty. What matters is family. What matters is doing the right thing instead of the easy thing. And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was heavy. Nathaniel closed the Bible and met Caleb's eyes with an expression of absolute finality. "Then you're no longer a Brennan. No more family gatherings, no more inheritance, no more support of any kind. You'll be on your own, truly on your own, for the rest of your life." Caleb looked at each of his siblings in turn. Thomas wouldn't meet his eyes. Jacob looked uncomfortable but resolute. Sarah was crying openly now. And Nathaniel looked like their father had looked when delivering a sentence that couldn't be appealed. "You can't be serious." "We've never been more serious," Nathaniel said. "We've watched you waste yourself for 12 years. We've enabled your isolation by leaving you alone. That ends today. Either you marry Martha Henley and become a part of this community again, or you cut ties with this family completely. Those are your choices." By now, half the town was watching. Caleb could feel their eyes, could imagine the gossip that would spread through every parlor and saloon by nightfall. The youngest Brennan boy getting forced into marriage. Poor Martha Henley being offered up like charity. The whole thing was humiliating for everyone involved. He wanted to mount his horse and ride away. He wanted to tell them all exactly where they could put their ultimatum. He wanted to disappear so far into the mountains that no one would ever find him again. But he couldn't, because despite 12 years of distance, despite his resentment and his pride, he was still a Brennan. And Brennans didn't abandon family, even when family was making a terrible mistake. "Fine," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'll talk to her." "No," Nathaniel said. "You'll marry her. A real marriage, legal and binding. We're not giving you room to back out." Caleb turned away from them, staring at nothing. Behind him, he heard Sarah sob once before composing herself. The town watched and whispered, and somewhere on the eastern edge of Pinewood Hollow, Martha Henley was going about her day, completely unaware that her life was about to be upended by the same family interference that was destroying his. The news reached Martha before sunset. Sarah brought it, which was the kindest option among bad choices. Martha was in her garden, pulling the last of the season's carrots, when Sarah came through the gate with the expression of someone bearing terrible news. "Martha, we need to talk." 20 minutes later, Martha sat at her kitchen table, with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Sarah had explained everything, the family meeting, the ultimatum, the plan. She tried to frame it gently, to make it sound reasonable and beneficial. But there was no gentle way to tell a woman that she'd been selected for a mercy marriage, that she was now the subject of the town's pity project. "No," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Absolutely not. Martha, please understand. I understand perfectly." Martha stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the workshop where Samuel's tools still hung. "Your family has decided that I'm helpless, that I need saving, that I should be grateful for the charity of being married to a man who doesn't want me, to solve a problem I didn't ask anyone to solve." "It's not charity," Sarah protested. "It's family taking care of family. I'm not your family, and I won't be pitied." Martha turned, and Sarah saw something fierce in her eyes. "I've managed for 3 years on my own. I'll manage for 30 more if I need to. Tell your brothers their help is not wanted." But Sarah was persistent, and over the course of an hour she wore down Martha's resistance the same way water wears down stone. She pointed out the practical realities, the roof that needed work, the well that was starting to fail, the coming winter that would be harder than the last. She reminded Martha that Samuel would have wanted her cared for, that there was no shame in accepting help, that Caleb needed saving as much as Martha did. "He's been alone too long," Sarah said softly. "Just like you have. Maybe you could help each other." Martha didn't believe it. But she was tired. Tired of maintaining a house meant for a family, tired of the pitying looks, tired of lying awake at night wondering what would happen when she was too old to work. And so, against her better judgment, she agreed. The proposal, if it could be called that, happened 2 days later. Caleb knocked on Martha's door at noon, hat in his hands, looking like a man facing execution. Martha invited him into her parlor, and they sat across from each other like strangers negotiating a business arrangement. "I don't want this," Caleb said immediately. "For what it's worth." "Neither do I," Martha replied. "But apparently we don't have much choice. We could both refuse, call their bluff." "Could you?" Martha asked. "Could you really cut ties with your family forever?" Caleb was silent. "I didn't think so." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "So here's what I propose. We marry, legally, to satisfy your family's ridiculous demand. We live under the same roof. But this is a practical arrangement, nothing more. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. You're free to come and go as you please. I'll continue managing my household as I see fit. We'll be civil to each other and nothing more." "Agreed," Caleb said immediately, relief evident in his voice. "Good." Martha stood, extending her hand. Caleb stood and shook it, a cold, formal gesture that sealed their fate. "The courthouse is open on Fridays. Shall we get this over with?" 3 days later, they stood before Judge Morrison with both their families present and half the town watching through the courthouse windows. Martha wore a simple grey dress. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and looked like he wanted to bolt. The ceremony took 7 minutes. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, neither moved to kiss. They simply turned to face their witnesses with matching expressions of resigned acceptance. Outside, well-wishers offered congratulations that felt like condolences. The Brennan siblings looked satisfied with themselves, certain they'd done the right thing. And Martha and Caleb, newly married and utterly miserable, prepared to begin a life neither of them wanted. The next morning, Caleb found Martha in the kitchen before dawn, which was unusual. She was normally a late riser, while he preferred to be up and moving before the sun. She had coffee brewing and was sitting at the table with Samuel's gathering hall drawings spread out before her. "Couldn't sleep," she said when she noticed him in the doorway. "Kept thinking about these." Caleb poured himself coffee and sat across from her. In the lamplight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her face unguarded, she looked younger than her 50 years. Softer. "I was thinking about them too," he admitted. "It's a fool's errand," Martha said, but there was no conviction in her voice. The amount of work it would take, the materials, the time. "We'd be laughed at." "Probably," Caleb agreed, "but it could be done. The structure is still mostly sound. Needs a new roof, yes. Floors need replacing, but the bones are good. You looked at it. Walked past it yesterday. Took a closer look." Caleb traced a line on Samuel's drawing. "Your husband knew what he was doing. This building was made to last. It just needs someone to care about it again." Martha met his eyes, and Caleb saw something there he hadn't seen before. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. "You really think we could do this?" "I think we'd be fools to try," Caleb said honestly. "But I also think I'm tired of living like a ghost, tired of hiding in the mountains, tired of not mattering to anyone. If we're stuck in this marriage, we might as well do something with it. Something real." It was the most honest Caleb had been since the wedding. Martha felt something shift in her chest, not attraction exactly, but recognition. Here was someone who understood the weight of purposelessness, who knew what it felt like to go through the motions of living without actually living. "Then let's go look at it," she said. "In daylight, properly, before we commit to this madness." They walked to the gathering hall together an hour after sunrise. It sat at the edge of town, a large rectangular building with a collapsed section of roof and broken windows. Weeds grew tall around the foundation. The double doors hung crooked on their hinges. It looked like a monument to decay, to the way communities let go of the things that matter. Martha pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The morning light streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes and debris. The floor was warped in places, rotted through in others. But the main support beams were intact, and when Caleb knocked on them with his knuckles, they sounded solid. "It's worse than I thought," Martha said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "But not hopeless," Caleb replied. He was walking the perimeter, examining the walls, testing floorboards. "I've seen worse. The foundation is good. The main structure is sound. This is cosmetic damage mostly. Time and neglect, not structural failure." Martha moved to the center of the room, where the dance floor had been. She could almost hear the music, see the couples moving in circles, feel the joy that had filled this space. "Samuel and I danced here on our wedding night," she said quietly. "Right here. He sang to me because the musicians were taking a break. He had a terrible voice, but I didn't care." Caleb watched her, seeing the weight of memory, the depth of her loss. He thought about his own losses, not a person, but a family, a sense of belonging, a belief in his own value. Different wounds, but wounds nonetheless. "If we do this," he said, "it won't be the same. We can rebuild the structure, but we can't bring back what was." "I know," Martha said, "but maybe we can build something new. Maybe the town needs a gathering place again. Maybe we need a reason to matter. Then let's do it." Caleb extended his hand, and Martha shook it, a partnership agreement, like the one they'd made on their wedding day, but different now, rooted not in resentment, but in shared purpose. The town's reaction was mixed. When Caleb and Martha announced their intention to rebuild the gathering hall, some people were supportive, others were skeptical, and a few were openly mocking. "That old building," Henderson at the general store shook his head. "That's a money pit. You'll bankrupt yourselves trying." "Let them try," Mrs. Patterson said to her quilting circle. "Poor things need something to occupy themselves with. Better than sitting in that house avoiding each other." But the Brennan siblings had different reactions. When Martha and Caleb presented their plan at Sunday dinner, the first family meal Caleb had attended in 12 years, the table went quiet. "You want to rebuild the gathering hall," Nathaniel said slowly. "Just the two of you." "That's right," Caleb replied, his jaw set. "We'll do most of the work ourselves, buy materials as we can afford them, take our time, and do it right." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying them both. That's a massive undertaking. Will take months, maybe a year. We have time, Martha said calmly. Jacob, always the practical one, asked the important question. Can you two even work together? You've barely spoken since the wedding. Caleb and Martha exchanged a glance, and something passed between them that surprised everyone at the table, a small smile, shared and genuine. We're learning, Caleb said. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but happy ones this time. Then we'll help, won't we? She looked at her brothers with an expression that brooked no argument. This is what we wanted, isn't it? For Caleb to be part of the community again, for Martha to have support. Well, here they are, trying to do something meaningful. The least we can do is support them. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. You're right. We'll help with what we can. Materials, labor on the heavy work, but this is your project, your vision. We'll follow your lead. It was an olive branch, and Caleb recognized it as such. He also recognized it as something more, an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the forced marriage had planted the seeds of something unexpected. The next morning, Caleb and Martha returned to the gathering hall with tools, plans, and determination. They started with the cleanup, hauling out debris, pulling up damaged floorboards, clearing away years of neglect. It was hard, dirty work, and by noon they were both filthy and sweating despite the November cold. I forgot how good it feels, Martha said, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. To build something, to see progress. I never knew, Caleb admitted. I was always too impatient to see it through. But this feels right. They worked side by side through the afternoon, developing a rhythm without needing to discuss it. Martha measured and marked. Caleb cut and carried. When one needed help, the other was already moving to assist. By the time the sun set, they'd cleared a quarter of the space, and both felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope, purpose, and the beginning of something that looked remarkably like partnership. 6 weeks into the project, the gathering hall was transformed. The debris was gone, replaced by neat stacks of new lumber donated by the Brennan Brothers Company. The worst of the damaged flooring had been removed, exposing the solid foundation beneath. The walls had been patched and reinforced. It was beginning to look like a building again rather than a ruin. Caleb and Martha worked together most days from dawn until dusk. Word had spread through Pinewood Hollow, and gradually people started offering help. Old man Johnson brought nails he'd had stored in his barn for years. The Patterson sisters organized a bake sale to raise money for windows. Even Henderson at the general store offered a discount on materials, saying, I admit I was wrong about you two. This is good for the town. The work created a rhythm in their lives that neither had expected. They rose early, shared breakfast, walked to the hall together. They worked side by side, their movements increasingly coordinated. She would measure a board, and he would already be reaching for the saw. He would position a beam, and her hands would be there with the level, checking alignment. It was the kind of wordless communication that usually took years to develop. Evenings, they sat on the porch of Martha's house, their house. Caleb was starting to think of it and discuss the next day's work. Sometimes they were too tired to talk much, sitting in companionable silence while the sun set behind the mountains. Other times they shared stories. Martha told him about building projects she and Samuel had completed together. Caleb shared tales of his years alone, though he edited out the loneliness. The long nights, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake leaving his family. One particularly cold evening, Martha brought out a small wooden box from the house. Inside was a music box, intricately carved with flowers and birds. She wound it carefully, and a waltz melody filled the air between them. Samuel made this for our 10th anniversary, she said softly. He spent 6 months on it, working in secret. He was so proud when he finally gave it to me. Caleb watched the small ballerina figure spin inside the box. It's beautiful work. We danced to this tune at the gathering hall once. It was winter, and the stove had gone out halfway through the evening. Everyone was freezing, but we kept dancing just to stay warm. Samuel held me close and said that no matter how cold the world got, we'd always have each other to keep warm. Martha's voice cracked slightly. I believed him. I thought we'd have decades more, and then a ladder broke, and he was gone. It was the most vulnerable Caleb had seen her. He wanted to say something comforting, but he'd never been good with words. Instead, he spoke his own truth. I left my family because I thought I was inadequate, thought I'd never measure up to my brothers, never be the kind of man my father was. I convinced myself I was better off alone, but I wasn't. I was just scared. Martha looked at him, really looked at him, and Caleb felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. Why did you agree to marry me? She asked. The real reason. Because I was still scared, he admitted. Scared of being completely cut off. Scared of being alone forever. Scared of admitting I needed people. He paused. I'm still scared, but I'm less scared than I was. Working on the hall, building something that matters, having someone to... He stopped, unsure how to finish. Having someone to share the work with, Martha completed gently. Yes. The music box wound down, the tune slowing and deepening before falling silent. Martha closed the lid carefully. I was angry when your family forced this marriage, felt like my life was being managed, like I was a problem to be solved. But now, she hesitated. Now, I think maybe I needed to be pushed. Needed someone to remind me that life isn't over just because the person you loved is gone. Is that what I am? Caleb asked. A hint of something hurt, maybe in his voice. A reminder? No, Martha said, meeting his eyes. You're something more than that. I'm just not sure what yet. The moment hung between them, charged with possibility and uncertainty. Then the cold drove them inside, and they retreated to their separate spaces, but both carried the conversation with them. Upstairs, Caleb lay in bed thinking about what something more might mean. Downstairs, Martha put the music box back in its place and touched the wedding ring Samuel had given her, then looked at the simple band Caleb had placed on her right hand during their courthouse ceremony. 2 rings, 2 marriages, one ending in death, the other beginning in resentment. But the second one, it was changing, evolving into something she hadn't expected. Not love, not yet, but partnership. Respect. The kind of bond that forms between people who work toward a common goal and discover they work well together. The next day at the hall, they worked without speaking much, but the silence was comfortable. Other townspeople came by. The blacksmith brought hardware for the doors. Mrs. Henderson delivered sandwiches for lunch. A group of young men offered to help lift the new support beams into place. The hall was becoming a community project, just as it had always been a community space. But everyone could see that at the center of it were Caleb and Martha, the unlikely couple who'd been forced together and had chosen to build something meaningful with that forced connection. They moved in sync now, anticipating each other's needs, working with the efficiency of long practice. "Would you look at that, old man?" Johnson said to the blacksmith as they watched Caleb and Martha mark out the floor joists. "Thought that marriage was doomed from the start. Turns out we were all wrong." "Turns out they were exactly what each other needed," the blacksmith replied. "Just took them a while to see it." And up in the rafters, where Caleb and Martha were securing a crossbeam, their hands touched as they both reached for the same tool. They paused, neither pulling away, and for a moment the world narrowed to just that point of contact. Then Martha smiled a real smile, warm and genuine, and Caleb felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 12 years. He felt like he belonged somewhere, to something, maybe even to someone. 3 months into the marriage, 3 months into the project, everything changed. The land surveyor arrived in Pinewood Hollow on a Tuesday morning, riding in on the morning stage with a leather satchel full of maps and documents. His name was William Garrett, and he represented the Colorado and Southern Railroad Company. By Tuesday afternoon, the whole town knew why he'd come. The railroad was planning a route through the valley, and Martha Henley's property, all 40 acres of it, including the house and the land the gathering hall sat on, was positioned perfectly for a station and depot. Garrett made his offer to Martha on Wednesday. $20,000. It was a fortune, more money than most people in Pinewood Hollow would see in a lifetime. More than enough for Martha to live comfortably for the rest of her days and still have plenty left over for her children. Martha sat in her parlor, staring at the papers Garrett had laid out on her table. She hadn't said yes, she hadn't said no. She'd asked for time to think, and Garrett had agreed, though he'd made it clear the offer wouldn't stand forever. The railroad had alternatives if she proved difficult. She didn't tell Caleb right away. She wanted to process it herself first, to understand what it meant. But in a town the size of Pinewood Hollow, secrets didn't last long. By Thursday morning, everyone knew about the offer. And by Thursday afternoon, the whispers had started. $20,000, Mrs. Patterson said to Mrs. Henderson in the general store, not bothering to lower her voice. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Wonder what? Mrs. Henderson asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. About the timing. About the marriage. That mountain man shows up, agrees to marry a woman 15 years older, starts this big public project, and suddenly there's a railroad buyout worth a fortune? You think he knew? I think it's mighty convenient. The gossip spread like wildfire. By evening, half the town was speculating about Caleb's motives. Had he known about the railroad plans? Had the whole thing been calculated, the reluctant agreement, the gathering hall project, the show of partnership, all designed to secure his position before the money came through? Martha heard the whispers when she went to pick up supplies on Friday morning. She saw the knowing looks, the pitying glances, the way conversation stopped when she entered rooms. And when Sarah Brennan pulled her aside with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm so sorry, Martha. We had no idea." Nathaniel is beside himself. Martha finally understood what they were saying. They thought Caleb had used her, that the marriage was a scheme, that everything between them had been a lie. She walked home in a daze, the weight of betrayal and doubt crushing her chest. She thought about the past 3 months, the work they'd done together, the conversations on the porch, the way Caleb had looked at her when she'd told him about Samuel, the vulnerability in his voice when he'd shared his own fears. Had it all been performance? Had she been a fool to trust him, to let her guard down, to believe that something real was growing between them? Caleb was at the gathering hall when she arrived. He was alone, working on the window frames, and he looked up with a smile when he heard her footsteps. The smile died when he saw her face. "Martha, what's wrong? Is it true?" Her voice was steady but cold. "About the railroad offer." Caleb's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "What railroad offer? Don't lie to me. The whole town knows. $20,000 for my property, for a depot station." She watched his face carefully, looking for signs of deception. "Did you know?" "What? No." Caleb set down his tools, stepping toward her. "Martha, I have no idea what you're talking about. What railroad?" "The Colorado and Southern. They want to buy my land, and everyone thinks you knew about it, that you married me to secure your position before the money came through." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. She saw it in his face, shock, followed by hurt, followed by the old defensive anger she remembered from their wedding day. You actually think I would?" "I don't know what to think." Martha's composure cracked. 3 months ago you wanted nothing to do with me. Now we're building this," she gestured at the hall, "and you're sharing your fears and your past." "You thought what?" Caleb's voice was hard now. "That I actually cared, that this meant something to me, and now you're ready to believe I've been manipulating you all along? The timing is suspicious. The timing is coincidence." Caleb grabbed his coat. "But of course you'd think the worst of me. Why wouldn't you? I'm the mountain man who ran away from his family, the failure who couldn't measure up. Obviously, I'm capable of anything. That's not fair. Fair, Caleb laughed, bitter and sharp. You want to talk about fair? I've spent 3 months proving myself to this town, to my family, to you. I've worked myself raw rebuilding this place, trying to create something meaningful, trying to... He stopped abruptly, shaking his head. It doesn't matter. You've already decided what kind of man I am, Caleb. Keep the money, Martha, all of it. I don't want a dime. Never did. He walked past her toward the door, then paused. I was starting to think this marriage might actually mean something, that we might have something real. Turns out I was wrong. He left her standing in the half-finished hall, surrounded by the work they'd done together, the dream they'd been building. And Martha stood there, watching him go, torn between doubt and regret. The next 2 weeks were agony. Caleb moved his belongings back to his mountain cabin. He didn't come to the gathering hall. He avoided town entirely. The Brennan siblings were in an uproar, Nathaniel confronting Martha, demanding to know what had happened. Thomas and Jacob caught between loyalty to family and sympathy for Caleb. Sarah crying and saying she'd ruined everything by pushing them together in the first place. Work on the hall stopped. The building sat unfinished, a monument to what might have been. The town watched and whispered. Some sided with Martha, insisting she'd been right to be suspicious. Others defended Caleb, arguing that he'd never shown any interest in money or property, that the accusation was unfair. Martha went through the motions of daily life, but inside she was drowning. She replayed every conversation, every moment, looking for signs of deception and finding none. She thought about Caleb's face when she'd accused him, the genuine shock and hurt. She thought about the way he'd worked on the hall, the pride he'd taken in doing things right, the patience he'd developed. She thought about his vulnerability when he'd shared his fears, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. And she realized, too late, that she'd made a terrible mistake. The railroad offer sat on her table, unsigned. Garrett had been back twice, each time more insistent. The decision deadline was approaching. But Martha couldn't bring herself to care about the money. What good was $20,000 if she'd destroyed the one real connection she'd made since Samuel's death? She wrote Caleb a letter, then another. She tore them both up. Words weren't enough. Nothing felt adequate to express the depth of her regret, her growing certainty that she'd been wrong, her desperate wish that she could take back the accusation, and the doubt. In his cabin, Caleb was equally miserable. The solitude that had once been his refuge now felt like exile. He'd gotten used to partnership, to shared purpose, to having someone who understood him. Going back to being alone was like losing a limb. The absence was physical and constant. His brother Nathaniel found him on the 14th day, climbed all the way up to the cabin and sat on the porch until Caleb agreed to talk. She was wrong, Nathaniel said bluntly. We all know it. The whole family knows it. Hell, half the town knows it. You're many things, little brother, but a schemer isn't one of them. Doesn't matter now. It matters, because you love her, don't you? The question hung in the cold mountain air. Caleb stared out at the peaks, thinking about Martha's strength, her skill, her vulnerability. The way she'd looked at the gathering hall with hope in her eyes, the sound of her laugh when he'd made a clumsy joke, the feeling of her hand touching his as they worked. Yes, he admitted quietly. I love her. Didn't expect to. Didn't want to. But somewhere between the resentment and the partnership, I fell in love with her. Then fight for her, Nathaniel said. Don't let pride keep you from the best thing that's happened to either of you. Caleb looked at his brother, seeing the wisdom that came from years of marriage, years of choosing love over ego. And he knew Nathaniel was right. But knowing it and having the courage to act on it were two different things. Sarah came next, 2 days after Nathaniel. She brought food, a basket of fresh bread and preserves, and sat with Martha at the kitchen table. Martha had dark circles under her eyes and looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. You need to eat, Sarah said, setting out the bread. I'm not hungry. Martha. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. You need to hear this. Caleb never cared about money, not once in his entire life. When he left the family business, he walked away from a significant inheritance. He lives in a one-room cabin with furniture he made himself. He trades furs for basic supplies and wants nothing more. I know. Martha's voice was barely a whisper. I know that now. I knew it then, really. But the timing seemed so convenient. Sarah squeezed her hand. Sometimes coincidence is just coincidence, and sometimes fear makes us see patterns that aren't there. You were scared of caring again, of losing someone again. So, when doubt was offered, you took it because it was safer than vulnerability. Martha's eyes filled with tears. I hurt him. I saw it in his face. He trusted me, and I threw that trust back at him. Then fix it, Sarah said simply. Tell him you were wrong. Tell him what he means to you. Don't let pride or fear keep you from the one person who's made you feel alive again. What if it's too late? What if he won't forgive me? Caleb holds grudges against himself, not against others. He'll forgive you. The question is whether you can forgive yourself. After Sarah left, Martha sat alone in the house that felt emptier than ever. She thought about the past 3 months, about how Caleb had changed her life without her realizing it. The way mornings felt less lonely with someone to share coffee with. The way work felt purposeful when done with a partner. The way evenings on the porch had become the best part of her day. She thought about the gathering hall sitting unfinished, about the community that had started to come together around the project, about all the promise and possibility that had been building brick by brick, board by board. And she thought about Samuel, about the love they'd shared, about how he would feel seeing her now paralyzed by fear, pushing away connection because she was terrified of loss. Samuel had always been brave in his love, generous with his heart. He would be disappointed to see her letting fear win. Martha stood and walked to her bedroom. She opened the wooden box where she kept Samuel's music box and her most precious memories. She took off the gold wedding band Samuel had given her 30 years ago, the ring she'd worn every day since, even after his death. She held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. I'll always love you, she whispered, but I think it's time to let go. Time to choose life over memory. She placed the ring carefully in the box and closed the lid. Then she looked at her right hand, at the simple band Caleb had placed there during their courthouse wedding. A ring she'd barely acknowledged, had thought of as meaningless ceremony. Now she slid it onto her left hand, where it belonged, where she wanted it to be. Meanwhile, up in the mountains, Caleb was having his own reckoning. After Nathaniel left, he'd spent hours sitting on his porch, staring at nothing, wrestling with his pride and his fear. He'd written in his journal pages and pages of thoughts he couldn't speak aloud. She was scared, just like I was scared. We've both been running from connection, from vulnerability, from the risk of caring and losing. When that doubt was planted, she took it because it was easier than admitting she cares. Just like I ran to the mountains because it was easier than admitting I felt inadequate. We're the same, her and me. Both damaged, both scared, both learning how to be whole again. He stared at those words for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and began writing a letter. Not for Martha, not yet, but for himself. A way to clarify what he felt, what he wanted, what he was willing to fight for. He wrote about meeting her in the workshop, seeing her skill with tools and recognizing a kindred spirit. He wrote about the gathering hall, about how building something together had shown him what partnership could be. He wrote about conversations on the porch, about music box waltzes, about hands touching while measuring boards. He wrote about falling in love without meaning to, without wanting to, but completely and irrevocably. When he finished, dawn was breaking over the peaks. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it in his coat pocket. Then he packed a bag and prepared to ride down to Pinewood Hollow. The storm hit that afternoon, unexpected and fierce. Spring storms in the Colorado mountains could be brutal, and this one brought driving rain and wind that bent trees and ripped loose shingles. In Pinewood Hollow, people rushed to secure their property, bringing in anything that might blow away. By evening, the storm had done significant damage. The Jenkins family homesteaders on the north edge of town with 6 children had a tree fall through their roof. The Wilsons' barn lost its entire west wall. And old man Peterson, still living alone after his wife's death, had his chimney collapse, making his house unlivable. The town needed shelter, fast, and the only building large enough to house multiple families was the gathering hall, the one that sat unfinished because Caleb and Martha had stopped working on it. Mayor Hutchins organized the response. He sent runners to gather volunteers, to collect blankets and food, to prepare the hall as best they could. And he sent Sarah to fetch Martha, because if anyone knew what still needed to be done to make the building safe, it was her. Martha arrived at the hall to find controlled chaos. People were sweeping out debris, setting up makeshift beds, trying to patch the worst of the leaks in the roof. But it was clear they needed someone who understood the building, who knew what was structural and what was cosmetic. She took charge without thinking, directing people to safe areas, identifying weak spots that needed immediate attention. They needed temporary support beams in the northwest corner. The floor near the door was still weak and needed to be marked off, and the roof they'd need to rig tarps to keep the rain out. She was organizing a crew to hang the tarps when she heard his voice. "You'll want to anchor those tarps to the rafters, not the walls. Walls won't hold in this wind." Caleb stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, his coat dripping water onto the floor. He had rope coiled over his shoulder and tools in his hands. And he was looking at Martha with an expression she couldn't quite read, hurt still there, but also determination. Caleb. His name came out as barely more than a breath. "People need help," he said simply. "Personal feelings can wait." He moved past her and began directing the men on the tarps. Martha watched him for a moment, her heart pounding, 1,000 words crowding her throat. Then she shook herself and went back to work. He was right. The crisis came first. They worked through the night, together but not together, coordinating but not speaking beyond what was necessary. Families arrived, the Jenkins with their 6 children, the Wilsons with their 3, old man Peterson looking lost and frail. Martha helped settle them, finding blankets and warm food. Caleb reinforced the structure, making sure everyone was safe. Around midnight, during a brief lull in the rain, they found themselves alone in the back corner of the hall. They'd been avoiding direct interaction all evening, but now there was no one else around, no crisis demanding immediate attention. Martha spoke first. "I'm sorry." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He was adjusting a support beam, checking its placement, but his hands stilled at her words. "I was wrong," Martha continued, her voice stronger now. "About the railroad, about your motives, about everything. I let fear make me doubt what I knew in my heart was true, and I hurt you. I'm so sorry." Caleb turned to face her. In the dim lamplight, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the emotional toll the past 2 weeks had taken. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why was it so easy to believe the worst of me?" "Because believing the best meant admitting I cared," Martha said, tears streaming down her face now. "It meant being vulnerable. It meant risking loss again. And I've already lost so much, Caleb. I didn't think I could survive losing someone else. She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "Someone you what?" Martha took a breath, committing to the vulnerability she'd been avoiding. "Someone I love. I love you, Caleb. I didn't expect to. I didn't want to. But somewhere between resenting you and working beside you, I fell in love with you, and that terrified me." The silence stretched between them. Caleb's expression was unreadable, and Martha felt panic rising. She'd said too much, pushed too far. He would reject her now, and she'd deserve it. Then Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this last night," he said, handing it to her. "I was going to give it to you today, before the storm hit." Martha unfolded the letter with shaking hands. As she read his words about partnership and falling in love, about building something together, about choosing vulnerability over safety, her tears fell harder. "I love you too," Caleb said softly. "Have for weeks now, maybe longer. I was coming down from the mountain to fight for you, to tell you that I don't care about the railroad money or what people think or how this started. All I care about is what we've built together. Not just the hall, us." Martha looked up from the letter, seeing the truth in his eyes, the openness that had been missing since the accusation. "Can we start over?" she asked. "Not from the beginning. I don't want to lose what we've built. But from here, from honesty and trust and choosing each other." Caleb stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He reached for her hands, and Martha took them without hesitation. They stood there in the half-finished gathering hall, surrounded by sleeping families and the sound of rain on the roof, and they made a new promise. Not a forced arrangement, not a business transaction, but a real commitment, born of choice and nurtured by love. Outside, the storm continued. But inside, two people who'd been forced together by circumstance and had chosen to stay together by love began rebuilding what fear had nearly destroyed. The decision came the following morning. Martha and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the railroad company's offer spread between them. $20,000, a fortune that could change their lives completely. William Garrett was due back that afternoon for their final answer. "What do you want to do?" Caleb asked, making it clear the choice was Martha's. The property was hers, legally and morally. He would support whatever she decided. Martha looked at the papers, then at Caleb, then out the window toward the gathering hall visible in the distance. "I want to tell them no," she said. "This land, Samuel built our house here. We raised our children here. And now you and I are building something here. The hall, yes, but more than that. A life. Together." $20,000 is a lot to turn down, Caleb said carefully. "It would secure your future. You'd never have to worry about money again." "I'm not worried about money with you," Martha said simply. "You're a trapper. You know how to provide, and I have my mending work. We'll manage. We always have." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Money can't buy what we're building here. Community, purpose, love. I don't want to sell that for any amount." Caleb felt something expand in his chest. Pride, love, gratitude that this woman had chosen him and this life over security and wealth. "Then we tell them no," he said, "together." When Garrett arrived that afternoon, he found them both waiting. Martha delivered the answer clearly and firmly. "Thank you for the offer, but we're declining. This land stays with the family. The gathering hall stays with the community. Some things aren't for sale." Garrett tried to negotiate, to sweeten the deal, but Martha was immovable. Finally, he accepted defeat gracefully. "I can't say I understand," he said, packing up his papers. "But I respect your decision. The railroad will find another route." After he left, the news spread through town rapidly. The reaction was mixed. Some thought Martha was foolish to turn down such money, but most understood and appreciated the choice. That evening, townspeople started appearing at the house and the hall, offering renewed support for the project. The Brennan brothers arrived with a truck full of lumber. "For the stage," Nathaniel said. "Every proper gathering hall needs a stage for the musicians." Henderson from the general store brought paint. "On the house," he said. "White for the exterior. Your choice for the interior." Even those who'd spread the ugly rumors about Caleb showed up to apologize and offer help. "We were wrong, Mrs. Patterson said, her face flushed with embarrassment. "We let suspicion cloud our judgment. You two are good for this town, for each other." Over the next weeks, the gathering hall came together with remarkable speed. The whole community contributed now, seeing it not as Martha and Caleb's project, but as their own. The roof was completed, solid and weathertight. The floors were finished, smooth and level. Windows were installed, walls were painted, and the stage was built to Samuel's exact specifications from his drawings. Caleb proved he'd learned patience and precision. Martha watched him work with pride, seeing how far he'd come from the impatient young man who'd fled his father's business. He measured twice and cut once. He took his time to do things right. And when he made mistakes, he fixed them without frustration, accepting imperfection as part of the learning process. One evening, as they stood back looking at the nearly completed hall, Caleb said, "I need to tell you something." Martha heard the seriousness in his tone and gave him her full attention. "That first night you showed me Samuel's drawings," Caleb continued. "I wrote in my journal that we could build something together, that it would be something real, something that matters." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was talking about the hall, but I was also talking about us. I think part of me knew, even then, that you were going to change my life." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "You changed mine too. Gave me a reason to care about tomorrow instead of just surviving today." "There's something else," Caleb said. He looked nervous now, vulnerable. "I want to renew our vows, properly this time. Not a courthouse ceremony with everyone resenting it, but a real wedding, with the people we love present, with promises we actually mean." "In the gathering hall?" Martha asked, already knowing the answer. "Where else? It's where you and Samuel met, where the community comes together, where we built our partnership." He took her hands. "I want to marry you there, Martha. Really marry you. Not because my family forced it, not because it's practical, but because I love you, and I choose you, and I want everyone to know it." Martha pulled him close, holding him tight. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, let's do it. Let's start over, right this time." The first dance would serve a dual purpose, they decided. A celebration of the completed gathering hall and a wedding celebration for Martha and Caleb. The community embraced the idea enthusiastically, throwing themselves into preparations with joy. The evening of the first dance arrived with perfect spring weather, warm but not hot. With a gentle breeze carrying the scent of mountain flowers, the gathering hall had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light across the polished floor. Wild flowers decorated every surface. The stage held a small group of musicians who'd come from neighboring towns, eager to play in the legendary hall that had been brought back to life. But before the dancing could begin, there was a wedding. Martha wore a dress Sarah had helped her sew, simple but elegant, pale blue like a Colorado sky. She'd left her hair down, silver threads shining among the dark, no veil, no pretense. Just herself, honest and open. In her hands she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers Caleb had picked that morning from the mountain meadows, columbine, Indian paintbrush, and lupine. Caleb wore a new suit, the first one he'd owned in 12 years. His brothers had insisted, and he'd allowed them to measure and fit him without complaint. He stood at the front of the hall with Nathaniel beside him, his best man this time, a role that felt right and earned rather than obligatory. The whole town was there, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, children sitting on the floor at the front. These weren't obligatory witnesses to an unwanted ceremony. These were friends and family gathering to celebrate something genuine and hard-won. Pastor Williams, who'd known both Martha and Samuel, stood ready to officiate. He'd married Martha and Samuel 30 years ago in this very building. Now he would marry Martha and Caleb in the building they'd rebuilt together. "We gather today," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying through the space, "not to begin something new, but to acknowledge and celebrate what has already been built. Martha and Caleb came together through circumstances not of their choosing, but what they've created together, this marriage, this partnership, this love that was entirely their choice. Martha and Caleb stood facing each other, hands joined. Looking into Caleb's eyes, Martha saw everything that had brought them here, the resentment that had become respect, the respect that had become friendship, the friendship that had become love. She saw the future too, stretching out before them, full of work and purpose and shared joy. "Martha," Caleb said when Pastor Williams invited him to speak his vows, "when we first married, I thought it was the end of my freedom. Turns out it was the beginning of my life. You taught me that partnership isn't prison, it's power. That building something together is better than building anything alone. That love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing someone real and building something perfect together." His voice caught with emotion. "I choose you. Every day, for the rest of my days. I choose you." Martha's tears flowed freely now, but she was smiling. "Caleb, I spent 3 years as a widow, thinking that part of my life was over, that I'd had my great love and nothing would ever measure up. I was wrong." She squeezed his hands. "You're not Samuel. You're not meant to be. You're Caleb, stubborn and wounded and brave in ways you don't even recognize. You gave me back my purpose, my joy, my future, and I choose you too, completely, without reservation, for all our days." They exchanged rings, new ones, purchased together, simple gold bands engraved with the date of this wedding, the real one. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Martha with tenderness and confidence, and the gathering hall erupted in applause and cheers. The ceremony transitioned seamlessly into celebration. The musicians struck up a waltz, the same tune Martha's music box played, the song she and Samuel had danced to years ago. Caleb led Martha onto the floor, and she guided him through the steps she'd been teaching him for weeks. He was still a little awkward, still counted beats under his breath, still occasionally stepped on her feet. But he was trying, and Martha loved him for it. They moved together across the floor they'd built with their own hands, surrounded by a community they'd helped bring back together, and it felt like everything had come full circle. Other couples joined them, Nathaniel and his wife, Thomas and his, Jacob and his. Sarah danced with her husband, tears of joy streaming down her face. Even old man Peterson, recovered and spry, took a turn with Mrs. Henderson. During a break in the dancing, Sarah found Martha on the porch, taking a moment to breathe and absorb everything. "You look happy," Sarah said, hugging her. "Truly, deeply happy." "I am," Martha said. "I didn't think I would be. Back in October when you all cornered us, I was so angry, so humiliated." "We were wrong to force it," Sarah admitted, "but somehow, miraculously, it worked out." "It worked out because we chose to make it work," Martha corrected gently. "You pushed us together, yes, but we decided to stay. We decided to build something, that was all us." Inside the hall, Caleb was talking with his brothers, all of them laughing at some shared joke. Martha watched him, seeing how he'd changed, how he stood straighter now, how he met people's eyes, how he belonged, not just to the family or the community, but to himself. He'd found his place. As if sensing her gaze, Caleb looked toward the porch. Their eyes met, and he smiled a full, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Then he set down his drink and walked toward her, hand extended. "One more dance?" he asked. Martha took his hand. "One more dance, and then another, and another after that, for all our days." They returned to the floor as the musicians began a new song. Around them, Pinewood Hollow celebrating the gathering hall, celebrating the marriage, celebrating the way two unlikely people had become exactly what their community needed. Above the hall, a new sign had been mounted that afternoon, hand-carved and painted, a joint project between Martha and Caleb. It read, "The Henley Brennan Community Hall." 2 names joined, 2 legacies honored, 2 lives built into one. And, As the music played and the couples danced and the children laughed and the lantern light flickered across the polished floors, Martha and Caleb held each other close and knew, beyond any doubt, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together, finally and fully together. The family who'd forced them into marriage watched from the sidelines, marveling at what they'd witnessed. What had seemed like an ending, two lonely people being pushed into an unwanted arrangement, had become the most beautiful beginning. Not because the family had been right, but because Martha and Caleb had been brave enough to choose love when they could have chosen resentment. Sometimes, the life we're forced into really does become the one we needed all along. But only if we're willing to do the work, only if we're willing to be vulnerable, only if we're willing to build something real out of what seems broken. Martha and Caleb had done that work. They'd built that life. And as they danced under the lights in the hall they'd rebuilt together, they knew that every scar, every doubt, every moment of pain had been worth it to arrive at this moment. This perfect, chosen, hard-won moment of joy.